welcome, Cindy. It's great to have you here virtually. Uh, since,
Thank you for having me.
oh, sure. Since you're fairly new in the statewide political arena, uh, why don't you start by telling us how you perceive the role of executive counselor?
So I think I have both my understanding of the role of the executive counselor as it exists now and a vision for how I would see that role expanding over time. Obviously, the executive council reviews all state contracts over $10,000. It reviews all nominations for state agencies, boards, and commissions. And it reviews, most importantly, I think, nominations for judicial appointments. It also has a role of preparing the transportation plan for the state of New Hampshire. It considers pardon requests, petitions for pardons and commutations of sentences. So it has a wide range of responsibilities. I think historically, the executive council, particularly with respect to nominations, has been, it has expanded its role. I know that Councilor Pignatelli expanded the role of hearings when they would conduct hearings, and so that now hearings for commissioners happen on a regular basis. And of course, they had the responsibility of having hearings for nominees and are responsible for vetting those nominees for agency positions and for judicial appointments. As far as the contracting process, this is an area where it seems to me there's a real opportunity for the executive council to expand its role. And I say that because I spoke with Andy Valinsky, his current executive counselor for this district, when I first considered my nomination, and said, you know, I can see what you've done on nominations, but talk to me about the contracting process. And are you able to sort of forward our values through the contracting process? And he said, really, Cindy, you can only move the dial such a little bit, because we get the contracts on Friday nights, we vote on them on Wednesday mornings. It's a huge stack of them, 100 to 200 of them sometimes. And he did ask questions about fair wages on many contracts, but he felt like, you're really asking the question too late in the process to have a meaningful impact. And at that point I said, so is there any reason why you can't start asking those questions earlier, before the request for proposals are even issued? And he said, that's a real opportunity. So after that, I spoke with some former commissioners of state agencies and some current employees of state agencies who said not only could that happen, but it should be happening. And I think that's a real opportunity for the executive council to ask a lot of questions at a time in the process when it can have a meaningful impact. So we can talk to them about fair wages. We can have questions in the request for proposals about diversity amongst contractors, among the workforce of the contractors. We can ask questions about whether they're using green technology or any energy efficient technology. I mean, there's a whole host of questions that simply aren't being asked right now, that if the executive counselors want to know that information, they can ask that they be included in the request for proposal. So I see that as a real opportunity for the executive council to really put the power that is in the executive council to work for the people of New Hampshire.
Excellent. Caleb?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that answer. I wanted to just follow up because, as Bill mentioned, you are fairly new to elected politics. So I wanted to speak about the experience that you do have. You spent the last 20 years as a healthcare attorney, including most recently for Shaheen and Gordon as their health law practice chair. So I wanted to ask how you think that experience will inform you or would inform you as an executive counselor.
Yeah, I think that one of the most important things, it seems to me, about the executive council right now is that right now, in the middle of COVID, and while our state budget, most of our state budget is health and human services, that we have no one on the executive council with a healthcare background. So I spent the last 20 years as a healthcare attorney, business and regulatory matters, and also 20 years before that in healthcare. So I started out while I was in college drawing blood at my local hospital as a phlebotomist, literally to put myself through school, 30 hours a week drawing blood, and earned my way through school. And my first job in New Hampshire brought me to Lakes Region General Hospital to work in the lab. And I was a lab tech. I went on, moved around a little, was a hospital business office manager, a hospital laboratory manager, a number of jobs and administrative positions in healthcare. And I think having somebody on the executive council that has a clinical and an administrative and a legal perspective on healthcare will really just bring an enormous amount of depth of knowledge in those areas that's much needed right now.
Thank you.
Okay. So you just been through a primary with 6 candidates, which I can't recall ever happening before for executive council. And throughout the race, the themes that were expressed by yourself and the other candidates largely tended to run toward what might be considered ideological issues: access to health care, income inequality, abortion rights, workers' rights, climate change. What does any of that have to do with, signing off on contracts and vetting nominees?
So I raised this issue throughout the campaign, is that a lot of people in this race were talking policy. And the executive council is not a policy-making body. The challenge on the executive council is to use the unique powers of the executive council in a way that forwards our values and forwards the values and the things that are important for the people of the state of New Hampshire. So let's just take, for instance, climate change. You mentioned climate change. So one of the things the executive council can do to address issues of climate change is to make sure that the commissioner of environmental services and agriculture, they would vet those nominees to make sure that they believe in climate change and that they would be forwarding those values. Contracts, I talked about asking about clean energy, about asking about green technology. And those are questions that we could ask in the RFP process, that contracting process. Healthcare, same thing. We need to have a commissioner of health and human services. And we need to, specifically, we can really increase access to care by really exploring the Medicaid managed care contracting. And there are some very specific ways that I have talked about on the campaign trail where we can explore and push the boundaries to expand access. So I think you're absolutely right that a lot of people are talking ideology on the executive council, which is fine, except then you have to take that next step and say, how are you going to transform that into actually doing something? How does that play out as an executive counselor, in your role as an executive counselor? And on each and every one of these issues, we have thought that through, right? In terms of workers' rights, we can start asking those questions about fair wages. Do they pay their workers healthcare benefits? Do they provide them with benefits? That's a question that isn't being asked right now. And it should be being asked, and that should be being asked in the contracting process earlier on. So in each and every issue, we have addressed how we would do it as an executive counselor.
Okay, so but there is a seemingly in the past few years kind of a partisan back and forth, and maybe that has always existed because it is a position where you run as a Republican or a Democrat. But it seems like there's been a lot more of partisan back and forth. And so if the main role of the council is to serve as a check on the power of the governor. And so how does that work in a partisan world? How do you see that you yourself functioning in that role?
So I guess I would say a couple of things. One, I have for 20 years served as an attorney who negotiates contracts for a living. And every single time that I sit down across the table from another party to negotiate a contract, they want at the outset something very different from what I want. And if we both dig in our heels, we're never going to get to yes, we're never going to get a contract. So the art of negotiation and of compromise is not something that is foreign to me. I understand that when there is common ground, that we will find it. I know how to find it, and am actually pretty ruthless about finding common ground when it's there, but also about standing my ground and knowing when we need to stand our ground. So I think that's important. Also, in my role as the chair of the platform committee for many years now, this is of course within the Democratic Party, so we're talking about Democrats, but Democrats don't agree on everything or almost anything. And so bringing Democrats together to find common ground, to articulate a platform that everyone could stand behind and get around is something that I have a lot of experience with. And I think that as a counselor, I would certainly be reaching out and looking for that common ground whenever whenever we can find it, but also knowing when we need to stand our ground.
Caleb?
So one of those issues where the executive council and the governor have been going back and forth is over how the state is distributing CARES Act funding. Earlier in the spring, there was some controversy over whether the governor would basically run that funding, how the state planned to run the funding, how the state planned to spend the funding by the executive council. He ended up showing about a third of that spending to the council, and the rest there's been very little oversight of. If the governor remains in office in November for the next 2 years, how do you plan to approach the oversight of that spending specifically for the COVID-19 crisis?
So the CARES Act funding money has to be spent by the end of this year. So I will not take office until the CARES Act money had been spent. So I can't answer specifically on that question, but let's assume there'll be more federal funds to come. I think that, really holding the governor's feet to the fire on this independent spending with no oversight. The people of New Hampshire elected a legislature, and it's a very large body, so that the people of New Hampshire have eyes and ears that they've elected, people that they've elected to be their representatives. There is a process that is in place that should be used, and for the oversight of the spending of this money. I think the governor is absolutely wrong to be going around the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee, and I think he's absolutely wrong to be placing these items on the agenda as informational items. I think we would explore opportunities to see if that is legal, but assuming that if we assume for the moment that it's legal, then questioning him on those informational items so that we can shine light on them for the public, I think is going to be the key role of the Executive Council in that particular area.
And just to clarify, to separate the Executive Council from the legislature, that would be your priority even if the legislature isn't given oversight of the spending, because there is a possibility that it could be just the executive council and
Exactly
not
right.
Okay.
Right. It makes the role of the executive council even more important when the governor is denying the people of New Hampshire the opportunity to have their elected officials provide oversight of that spending of an enormous amount of money. Then the last line of defense, the last opportunity that the people of New Hampshire have to be represented here is on the executive council.
Thanks. Cecily?
Thanks. As mentioned, one of the responsibilities of the Executive Council is to vote on judicial nominees. And so what are your standards for approving someone? What are kind of the factors that would go into your vetting a nominee?
So first, I would like to say that historically in New Hampshire, there has been a bipartisan judicial review, judicial screening committee that has vetted judges and presented the governor with choices of individuals who meet sort of the basic criteria for being a judge. And then other governors of both parties have chosen judges based on the recommendations made by the Judicial Screening Committee. That committee is no longer being used. Governor Sununu has opted not to have a judicial screening committee, and therefore it imposes an even bigger burden on the executive council to really be doing that vetting. And so I would just say that that commission would have reviewed for some threshold things like, do they have the basic training and experience to be a judge? You know, how much courtroom experience have they had? What's their legal background? You know, those kinds of things. Have they shown the demeanor that we would want to see in a judge? That commission would often have taken into consideration things like what opposing counsel might say about a nominee, what judges who are currently sitting on the bench that lawyer had appeared before might say. And all of that is now missing, and that is left to the executive council to take on those responsibilities. So obviously I would have to start there, right? Because that threshold would not have been done already. And so would have to start there with really digging into that person's training, experience, and basic qualifications for the job. And in addition to that, you know, I would require that any nominee for a judge position has a demonstrated commitment to upholding our fundamental rights. And that is critical to me, that we do that, and including our reproductive rights that are so at stake at this particular time.
We mentioned earlier that the executive council oversees the state's transportation plan. So at this moment, what are your thoughts about the current plan? What do you say works and what might need changing?
So I have, as a candidate, spent time talking to people across the region about what they want to see in the transportation plan. As an executive counselor, I would be on a listening tour. So I have received some information, but recognize that as an executive counselor, I would be receiving much, much more information and conducting a listening tour all across the state in order to develop that transportation plan. In Cheshire County, I have toured with Representative Lucy Weber all of the bridges along the Vermont border. I have talked with her about the burden it will place on people in Cheshire County should those bridges not be replaced. Should there be a period of time when they do not have access across the river, and how much of a burden it will place on people to have to drive many miles, like 30 miles around, to get access to things that are across the river. I understand the importance of that. I will be listening and reflecting what the people of Cheshire County want. Those issues are different, of course, across the district. You know, here in Concord, they're looking at the I-93 expansion, and over on the Seacoast, they're looking at, you know, different, an exit 10 for Somersworth and other issues over there. But those are issues that are very different across the district. My commitment is to listen and to reflect what I'm hearing from the people in my district.
Thanks.
One of the things that you've talked about is improving the communication between the council and the legislature. So why do you think that's needed, especially right now? And how would you actually go about doing it?
So I actually have had conversations with the president of the Senate and many legislators about this. And one of the places I think it is most needed is when the fiscal committee makes decisions about funding, and then that something gets lost in translation between what the fiscal committee decides and what the executive council then sees at a later date. And so having that communication to make sure that there's a heads up to the executive council that there's an issue that came before fiscal, and fiscal made a determination on it, and now there's something different that is, you know, that is being considered by the executive council, or by the time it got to the executive council, it looks very different. That kind of communication, I think, is particularly important, and that is what I have heard from the people that I have spoken with about it.
I wonder if I could just jump in with a quick follow-up on Caleb's last question. You mentioned some distinctions within the district in the transportation realm, but given the serpentine nature of the district, I wonder if there are other issues that you see are peculiar and important to this part of the district as opposed to other parts of the district.
Well, obviously the bridges, you know, that I mentioned were raised for me. I understand that rail is not as big an issue for, at least I've been told, for the Keene area as public transportation and the lack of public transportation, and the, you know, the access via the roads, especially, you know, in poor weather conditions, that, you know, there is just a needed improvement in the roads, and that's such an essential part of the economic development for your area. And I think that, you know, I don't know all those issues intimately at this point, but again, my job as an executive counselor would be to listen and hear those. There's a lot of work that goes into that plan. There are hearings that are conducted all around the state, and that would be my responsibility. I think you're on mute, Bill.
There we go. Sorry. And I unmuted and muted at the same time. The double click. So do you think that the process that by which the 10-year plan is put together works well? Are there things that you wonder about how that works? Because it seems like it goes together, but, you know, even though it's called a 10-year plan, we've seen, you know, projects start out, you know, 5 years out, and the next thing you know, it's 20 years out on the 10-year plan.
Yeah.
Are there any things that you think process-wise ought to happen with that?
I have to say I don't know that process very well right now, but I have, you know, I have certainly looked at and spoken with people about these funding issues, that something ends up on the plan. It's on the plan, but of course, because the funding isn't available, it just keeps getting pushed out further and further on the plan. Other priorities come in as there are, you know, more imminent issues, say a bridge that's about to collapse or whatever, that ends up coming up on the plan. So, I mean, I think that I don't know that process very well right now. It's something I will have to, you know, learn more about as an executive counselor. But I think it's imperative that we look at it so that we're actually moving forward instead of not gaining ground or even losing ground in some cases. And, I think that, we are. I think, we're going to see a lot of challenges, budget challenges in the next year. And of course, as far as highways goes, there was a pretty significant period of time where people weren't driving through the tolls this year and where people weren't spending money on gas. And, there is going to be a funding issue that's going to have to be addressed. And we just need to make sure that, we do reprioritize. We have a 10-year plan, but sometimes it is necessary to reprioritize based on the current circumstances.
Sure. So we're kind of winding down this interview, but before we wrap things up, is there anything else the voters ought to know about you before they cast their votes?
Well, I am the mother of two and proud grandmother of two. I was a working mom and a professional mom, so have a very good, understanding of what what it means to be a working mother and for working families trying to make ends meet. I did not come from, a wealthy family. I really had to earn my own way. And so I have a complete appreciation for people who work hard and put in a good day's work, the value of work, the dignity of work. I think a priority for me is that we do everything we can to make sure we support working families, that they should be able to feed their children, give them a good education, put clothes on their backs and a roof over their head, and be able to retire with dignity. And there is no reason why that cannot happen in our state. And from my seat on the Executive Council, I will do everything I can to use my powers as an executive counselor to forward those values. And of course, as everyone who knows anything about me, as healthcare is my life's work. And I am a true advocate for healthcare for all, everybody. And I would be fighting for that every day that I am on the Executive Council.
Okay. Well, we appreciate you taking the time, Olivia as well, and good luck in the race.
Thank you. Thank you all.